They said she was crazy, a woman who'd never roped a steer, never broke a horse, never spent a night in a bunkhouse, standing alone in a dry dust corral, reaching her hand toward a stallion that had already sent 2 experienced cowboys to the hospital. The men leaning against the fence that morning, they laughed, not out loud at first, just that low, slow kind of chuckle that men share when they think they already know how a story ends. They were wrong. Before we get into what happened in that corral, I need to ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone expected you to fail, and then you didn't? Because what this woman did with that horse wasn't just about survival. It was about something nobody in that county saw coming, a kind of understanding between a grieving woman and a broken animal that neither of them could explain in words. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit that like button right now, subscribe if you haven't yet, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. Now let me take you back to where this really started. The town of Harland Falls, Montana, sits in a valley so wide and so flat that on a clear day you can see storm clouds forming 40 miles out. Watch them build from nothing into something enormous before they ever reach you. People there joke that the land gives you no excuses. What's coming comes. You either get ready or you don't. Cesaly Voss had grown up in Harland Falls, but she hadn't been raised on a ranch. Her father, Emmett, had run the town's only hardware store for 30 years, and her mother, Nadine, had taught 2nd grade at the elementary school. She'd grown up with paint-stained hands and a library card, not with calluses and saddle soap. She was the kind of girl who could quote poetry, but couldn't tell you the difference between a quarter horse and a paint. Then she married Garrett Voss. Garrett was everything the land produced when it decided to be generous, quiet, steady, stubborn in the good way, with hands that could fix anything, and a voice so unhurried that just hearing him talk made your shoulders drop. He ran the Voss family ranch, a 4,200-acre spread called the Double Crook, which his grandfather Olen had built from nothing, and his father Burnett had expanded over 40 years. When Cesaly married Garrett at 24, she didn't know much about cattle or fencing or the particular cruelty of hailstorms in June, but she learned. She learned because Garrett taught her without making her feel stupid, and because the land itself, this enormous, indifferent, beautiful piece of Montana, turned out to be a decent teacher too. They had 10 years together, good years, the kind of years you only fully understand once they're over. Garrett died in the 3rd week of November, a Tuesday afternoon, out in the north pasture. The tractor rolled. Nobody saw it happen. Their ranch hand, a 19-year-old named Odie, who'd been with them only 4 months, found him an hour later when Garrett didn't come back for supper. Cesaly was 34 years old. She had a ranch to run, 280 head of cattle, 2 full-time ranch hands. Odie and a weathered, skeptical man named Sully, and absolutely no idea whether she was going to make it through spring. The rest of the county, it turned out, had opinions about that. Some of those opinions were kind. Her neighbor Alma Prescott brought casseroles every week for 2 months. The feed store owner, a big-bellied, soft-hearted man named Floyd Draper, gave her a line of credit without being asked. The veterinarian, Dr. Wren Calloway, made a point of driving out to the Double Crook every couple of weeks just to check in, never charging a consultation fee, never making a fuss about it. But there were other opinions too. Harland Falls had a particular social ecosystem, as most small towns do. A set of men who had been watching the Voss land with interest for years and who now, with Garrett gone, saw possibility. The 2 loudest of them were Crockett Hale and his younger brother Dax, who ran their own operation 12 miles east and had long coveted the Double Crook's water access along the Harland River. They weren't cruel men, exactly. They were just the kind of men who believed that land should belong to people who understood it, and they had already decided that a hardware store owner's daughter from town did not qualify. Crockett started dropping by the Double Crook in January, never uninvited exactly, but always unannounced. Always when Cesaly was in the middle of something difficult, always with a slightly pitying expression that managed to feel like an insult disguised as concern. He'd look around the yard, look at the fence she was repairing or the feed she was distributing, and he'd say something like, "That's a lot for one woman," which was technically true, which was also, she understood perfectly well, a prelude to an offer. She always said she was managing fine, thank you. He always nodded slowly, like he didn't quite believe her. Sully, her older ranch hand, was not as openly hostile as Crockett, but was in some ways harder to deal with, because his doubt was quieter and therefore more constant. He'd been with Garrett for 11 years. He respected Garrett. He was not yet sure what he thought about Cesaly, and he didn't bother to hide it. He did his work. He answered her questions. But there was a reserve in him, a watchfulness, that made her feel perpetually on trial. Only Odie, young, earnest, still knew enough to ranch life that he hadn't yet developed an ideology about who belonged in it, treated her like a person instead of a problem. That was the world Cesaly was living in when the Stallion arrived. His name was Flint, not a name she'd given him. That was what he came with, written on the papers, though anyone who'd ever tried to handle him would probably have chosen something with more menace. Flint sounded like a clean, simple thing. Flint was not a clean, simple thing. He was a Kager Mustang, dark bay almost to the point of being black, with a streak of white on his left forelock that looked like something had burned him there. 17 hands. Not the tallest horse Cesaly had ever seen, but built in a way that made you aware of his proportions. Deep chest, neck like a crane, legs that seemed to coil when he stood still. He moved like he was deciding whether or not to bother with gravity. He'd come to the double crook, through a chain of circumstances that Cesaly still wasn't entirely sure she'd pieced together correctly. The short version, a man named Levon Pruitt, who ran a horse operation down near Billings, had acquired Flint through a Bureau of Land Management adoption 3 years ago, had spent 18 months trying to break him, had failed comprehensively, and had eventually sold him to a rodeo outfit. The rodeo outfit had tried and failed for another year. Then, through a slightly murky set of transactions involving a debt and a handshake, Flint had ended up consigned to an auction house in Harland Falls. Garrett had seen him there 6 weeks before he died. He hadn't told Cesaly why he bought him, or rather, he'd said something characteristically indirect, something about how a horse that didn't break was worth paying attention to, worth figuring out. She hadn't asked him to elaborate. That was the kind of thing you didn't need to explain between them. Now Flint was in her corral, and Garrett was gone, and the explanation had died with him. She'd done her research. She'd called Levon Pruitt down in Billings, who'd been generous enough to tell her exactly what she was dealing with. The horse was not mean, Levon said. He wasn't a kicker or a biter, not aggressive in the typical sense. He was simply ungovernable by any method anyone had thought to try. He'd been worked with a round pen. He'd been given extensive gentling time. 3 different trainers had tried their hand, all experienced, all eventually walking away with some version of the same conclusion. The horse doesn't want to be handled, and he's smart enough to make that point effectively. One trainer, a woman out of Bozeman named Thora, who had 30 years of experience and a reputation that spread across 3 states, had told Levon flat out, "Some horses aren't broken because nobody's found the right door yet, and some horses aren't broken because the door isn't there." Cesaly read all of this and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, recognition. She didn't tell anyone that. Especially not Sully, who would have looked at her the way you look at someone who's just said something that makes you tired. The morning she went into the corral for the first time, Sully and Odie were both watching from the fence. She hadn't asked them to be there. They'd shown up anyway, which told her everything she needed to know about the situation. Sully at least half expecting to call an ambulance. Odie simply nervous on her behalf, in the loyal, helpless way of someone who has no expertise to offer. Crockett Haley happened to be there too, which was either bad timing or bad luck or something more deliberate. He was leaning against the post at the far end of the fence, arms crossed, wearing the kind of expression that was almost a smile. She ignored all of them. What she did inside that corral that first morning was almost nothing. She walked in. She didn't approach Flint. She didn't try to catch his eye or make any overture toward contact. She just walked to a spot about 40 feet from where he stood, and she sat down in the dirt. Just sat. Flint wheeled away from her immediately, moved to the far side of the corral, put his hindquarters toward her the way horses do when they're communicating something unambiguous. She sat in the dirt and looked at the mountains on the horizon and didn't move. 15 minutes, 20. She heard Crockett say something to Sully in a low voice. Couldn't make out the words. Heard the tone of it well enough. She stayed another 10 minutes. Then she stood up, dusted off her jeans, and walked out of the corral without looking at anyone. She came back the next morning and did the same thing, and the morning after that. By the fourth morning, Flint had stopped moving away from her when she entered. He was still positioned at an angle, not facing her, not fully ignoring her. But there was a difference, some subtle recalibration that she wouldn't have been able to describe to anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. It was in the set of his ears, maybe, the way his weight was distributed. Odie noticed. He didn't say anything, but she caught him watching more carefully than before, with less anxiety and more something else. A dawning attention that recognized something was happening, even if he couldn't name what. Sully, as far as she could tell, was not noticing anything, or was choosing not to. Crockett came by on the fifth morning with his brother Dax, and the two of them watched for about 10 minutes before Crockett said, loud enough to be heard clearly, "She's going to spend a year sitting in that corral and still not be able to lead him out." Cesaly didn't turn around. What she was thinking, in that moment, sitting in the dirt while Flint stood 30 feet away and the wind came down off the mountain and carried away the sound of men who had already decided she would fail. What she was thinking was something Garrett had said to her once years ago about a fence post that kept coming loose no matter how many times he drove it back in. "The problem isn't the post," he'd said. "The problem is what you're not seeing underneath." She was going to find out what was underneath. By the end of the second week, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing about this was ever going to be dramatic, she'd begun to understand. Not in the way that the word implies speed or a single decisive moment. It was more like the way a season changes, so gradually that you're never sure exactly when it happened, only that one day you look up and it has. Flint had started taking a few steps toward her during her corral sessions. Not many. Not close, but the direction had reversed, and direction, she was learning, was everything. She'd been reading in the evenings, working through a stack of books on equine behavior that Dr. Wren Calloway had lent her. Practical texts, not the mystical horse whisperer variety, just careful, methodical literature about how horses actually think and what they actually need. What she was learning was simultaneously humbling and clarifying. She'd been approaching the problem, without knowing it, in exactly the right way. Not because she was instinctively gifted with horses. She wasn't, not especially. But because her approach had come from somewhere that had nothing to do with horses at all. It had come from grief. When you have spent months learning how to exist in the presence of an absence, learning how to be in a room where someone no longer is, learning how to stop reaching for the voice that doesn't come anymore, you develop a particular fluency with stillness. You learn that presence doesn't require performance, that being in a place, quietly, without demand, without agenda, is itself a kind of communication. That was what she'd been doing with Flint. Not training him, not trying to gentle him in the clinical sense, just being present with him in a way that made no demands and therefore represented, to this horse who had been managed and pushed and roped and worked for 3 years by people who wanted something from him, something entirely new. She started to understand, as the second week progressed, what Garrett had been thinking when he bought him. He'd seen the same thing she was only now figuring out. He'd recognized something in the horse, that particular quality of a creature that has been mishandled not through cruelty, but through incomprehension. The horse hadn't been broken because nobody had thought to stop trying to break him. She wanted to cry when she understood that, not sadly exactly, just in the way you cry when something clarifies. On the 9th day, Flint walked to within 12 feet of her and stopped. She didn't move. She breathed. She looked at the ground. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes and then walked away. She counted it as the most significant thing that had happened to her in months. Sully saw it. He said nothing, but that evening he stayed a little longer than usual when he was putting the horses up, and she noticed him glancing toward the corral twice on his way back to the truck. That was, for Sully, the approximate equivalent of writing her a letter. What she didn't expect was the phone call she got that same evening from Thora Beckett, the trainer from Bozeman, who'd once told Levon Pruitt that some horses simply didn't have a door. Somehow, through Wren, she later found out, who had a way of quietly connecting people who needed to know each other. Thora had heard about what was happening at the Double Crook. She called at 7:30 in the evening, and what she said was not what Cesaly expected. "Don't rush the gate," Thora said, after they'd talked for about 15 minutes. "Whatever you're doing in there, don't add the gate too early. Most people, when they start getting somewhere with a horse like that, they get excited and they jump to the next step before the current one is finished. The horse always knows." Cesaly asked her, "How you know when a step is finished?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "When you stop wondering if it is," Thora said. She held that for a long time after she hung up. Meanwhile, Crockett was making his move. He came by on a Wednesday morning with a typed document, a purchase offer for the Double Crook. Not a predatory number, she had to admit. It was fair market value, maybe slightly above. He set it on the kitchen table with the careful neutrality of a man who has practiced not seeming eager. "I know it's a lot to think about," he said. "But Cesaly, look at what you're dealing with. The ranch, the cattle, that horse in the corral. It's too much for one person. There's no shame in it." She picked up the document. She read it once, all the way through, while he sat across from her with the patience of a man who believed time was on his side. Then she put it back on the table. "I'm not selling, Crockett." He leaned forward slightly. "Now, I understand emotionally. I said, I'm not selling." Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. "You're going to run this place into the ground," he said, and there was less neutrality in it now. "You know that, right? Garrett kept it together because Garrett knew what he was doing. You're a good person, Cesaly, but good doesn't keep a ranch solvent." She stood up. "I think you know your way out." He left. She stood at the window and watched his truck move down the long dirt driveway toward the highway, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not exactly, but a version of anger that had solidified into something more useful, something load-bearing. She went back to the corral. Flint was standing in the center of it, facing the gate, which was unusual. He watched her come in. She sat down in her usual spot. After 11 minutes, he walked over to her and stopped 6 feet away. She sat very still. She did not reach out. He dropped his nose toward the ground, then raised it again and exhaled through his nostrils. A long, low breath, the kind that horse people will tell you means a horse is releasing tension. She felt the back of her throat tighten. "Hello," she thought. "I've been waiting." There is a moment that every person who has worked with a difficult animal describes the same way, no matter how different their backgrounds or their methods. It's the moment when the animal stops assessing you and starts trusting you. And it doesn't look the way you think it will. It doesn't look like a surrender. It looks more like a recognition, like the animal has been waiting for you to become something specific, and now, finally, you are. For Cesaly and Flint, that moment came on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of January, when the temperature was 11 degrees and the corral fence was rimed with frost, and her breath hung in the air in long white clouds. She had started in the past few days, bringing a cup of coffee with her when she sat with him, not for any strategic reason, just because it was cold and she needed the warmth. She sat in the usual spot, both hands wrapped around the mug, and Flint had come to stand near her, 5 feet, then 4, the distance compressing so gradually she was no longer tracking it consciously. That morning, he walked directly to her, and put his nose on her shoulder. Not forcefully, not with any agenda. He just rested his nose there, breathing, and stayed. She did not move for a very long time. Later, she would try to describe it and find that language was insufficient, not because the thing itself was mystical, but because the emotional register it occupied didn't have good vocabulary. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even joy, exactly. It was something quieter and older, something that had to do with being met. She reached up, very slowly, and laid her hand on the side of his face. He didn't move. She pressed her forehead to the bridge of his nose. He breathed. Odie, watching from the fence, took his hat off and held it in both hands, which was apparently how he expressed things he didn't have words for. Sully was also watching. When she came out of the corral 20 minutes later, he was standing by the water trough with his arms at his sides, and he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. "I owe you an apology," he said. She wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. "I've been treating you like a problem to manage," he said, "instead of a person to work for. That's not right." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Sully. I'm a stubborn old man. Yes, I was wrong. Yes." He picked up a shovel and went back to work, and that was the end of it, and it was, as far as Cesaly was concerned, exactly right. Word travels in small towns the way water travels on flat land, everywhere eventually, by whatever path it finds. Within a week, people were talking about the widow and the horse. Some of it was generous, some of it was the kind of skeptical fascination that comes from watching someone do something you'd expected to go wrong. Dr. Wren Calloway came out on a Saturday and stood at the fence for an hour watching Cesaly work with Flint in the corral. Not from a distance anymore, but close, actually close, the two of them moving together in the easy, unhurried way of two people who have decided to be honest with each other. When Cesaly came out, Wren handed her a cup of coffee from the thermos she'd brought and said very simply, "He's going to be something." "He already is something," Cesaly said. "Yeah," Wren smiled. "That's what I meant." Thora Beckett drove down from Bozeman the following Tuesday. She arrived unannounced, which felt deliberate, as if she'd wanted to see the thing in its natural state rather than prepared for observation. She watched for 30 minutes without saying a word. Cesaly didn't acknowledge her until she was done. When she finally came around to the fence, Thora looked like someone who had confirmed something she'd suspected. "What's your method?" she asked. "I don't have one," Cesaly said. Thora looked at her sidelong. "That's not true. If I have one, I haven't named it." "What does it feel like when you're in there with him?" Cesaly thought about that for a moment. She thought about the absence that had taught her presence. She thought about sitting in rooms where Garrett no longer was, learning to inhabit the space without filling it. "Like grief," she finally said, which is to say, like paying attention without needing anything back. Thora was quiet for a long moment. "That's the best description I've ever heard," she said, "and I've been doing this for 31 years. Meanwhile, the practical work of the ranch continued, the unglamorous, relentless machinery of a cattle operation in winter. Cesaly was up before 5 every morning. She was doing things she'd never done before Garrett died, and had no choice but to do now, assessing herd health, managing the feeding rotation, making calls to the vet and the bank and the feed supplier, navigating the 1,000 small decisions that together constituted the difference between a ranch that survived and one that didn't. She was learning, day by day, in the accelerated, uncomfortable way that necessity teaches. She was exhausted in a bone-deep, structural way that she suspected wouldn't fully lift until spring. But something else was happening too. The double crook was beginning to feel less like Garrett's ranch and more like hers, or more precisely, like theirs together, a thing they'd built and were still building, even now, even with him gone. She couldn't fully explain that to herself. It just felt true. Crockett Hale had been quiet since the morning she'd handed his offer back to him. His truck hadn't come down her driveway. She knew he hadn't abandoned the idea. Men like Crockett didn't abandon ideas. They simply relocated their patience. But for now, The pressure had eased, and she was grateful for it. She had enough to focus on. Flint was ready for the next step, the halter. In the ordinary vocabulary of horse training, the halter is a beginning. A rudimentary thing, a first step, the point at which a horse accepts the presence of rope and human direction at its most basic. For most horses, it's achieved in days. For Flint, it was the obstacle that had defeated everyone who'd tried. 3 trainers, 18 months of work. The halter had simply never happened. Cesaly spent 2 days just holding it in the corral, not near Flint, not approaching him with it, just letting it exist in the space they shared. She'd read enough now to know that the object itself often carries the emotional freight of past attempts, that a horse as intelligent as Flint would have assigned meaning to it, and that meaning was almost certainly bad. She was trying to empty the halter of its history. On the 3rd day, she moved a little closer with it. He watched. He didn't withdraw. On the 5th day, she let him smell it. He lifted his nose to it, breathed across the leather, pulled back once, then returned. That return was everything. On the 7th day, she slid it over his nose, gently, and he let her. He let her. She buckled it with hands that were steadier than she would have expected, because the steadiness wasn't coming from confidence exactly. It was coming from having given up on the outcome, from having released the need for it to go right. She'd been in that place for weeks now, in the corral and elsewhere, and it turned out that release was its own kind of power. She led him with a light line around the corral. He walked with her. She'd never seen Odie move fast, but he ran to the bunkhouse and came back with his phone and took a video without asking permission. And she was glad he did, because later it would matter to have the record of it. Not for anyone else, necessarily, but for herself, for the moments when she wasn't sure if it had really happened the way she remembered. Sully, standing at the fence, said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I'll be damned." It was, coming from Sully, essentially a standing ovation. What happened next was something nobody anticipated. Thora Beckett, back in Bozeman, had mentioned the situation to a journalist friend of hers, not maliciously, not as a story pitch, just in the offhand way you mention remarkable things to people who notice remarkable things. The journalist, a woman named Reva, who covered agriculture and Western life for a regional magazine, had become interested. She called Cesaly. Cesaly, who was not a person who sought attention and had been deeply suspicious of the phone call, agreed to talk for 20 minutes and ended up talking for 2 hours. The story that ran 6 weeks later was not a horse story. Or not only, it was a story about grief and land and the particular stubbornness that the West sometimes produces in people, the refusal, against all practical logic, to let go of something that matters. The magazine used a photograph that Odie had taken. Cesaly standing in the corral, Flint's nose against her shoulder, the frost-rimed mountains behind them. The whole thing rendered in winter light that made it look slightly unreal. The response was not what she expected. Letters came. Actual letters, handwritten, from people across Montana and Wyoming and Idaho. Mostly women, she noticed, many of them widows, or simply people who had been told at some point that something they were holding on to was more than they could manage. They'd written to say they understood, that they were trying too, that the photograph had made them feel something they needed to feel. She read every one of them. Crockett Haley read the article too. She knew this because his wife, a quiet woman named Betta Ann, whom Cesaly had always liked despite the awkwardness between their husbands, called to say congratulations, which was kind of Betta Ann and probably more complicated for her than it sounded. The article changed something in Harland Falls. Not everything. Towns don't change wholesale over a magazine piece, but something. The quality of attention that people paid her shifted slightly, lost a little of its provisional quality. She was still being watched, still being assessed, but the terms of the assessment had changed, and then, in the middle of all of this, Flint got sick. It came on suddenly, the way colic does, that particular equine emergency that is not one thing but many things. a spectrum of digestive crises that can range from manageable to fatal in a matter of hours. Doctor. Wren Calloway got the call at 10 at night and drove out immediately. And what she found when she arrived was not a panicked woman who didn't know what she was dealing with. It was Cesaly in the barn, on her knees, with her hand on Flint's flank, talking to him in a low, steady voice, monitoring his pulse and his breathing and the quality of his pain with a calm focus that Wren told her later was better than most people she'd trained clinically. It was a long night, a bad one. The colic was severe, displaced colon, which meant surgery was possible and probably necessary if he didn't resolve. Cesaly did not leave his side. At some point around 3 in the morning, she was aware of Sully sitting on a hay bale behind her. He hadn't said anything. He'd simply appeared. She heard him pouring coffee from a thermos at some point and felt a cup placed on the floor near her hand. "You should sleep," he said. "No." "At least sit back." "No." He didn't argue. He stayed. Odie arrived at 5, having apparently gotten up early on instinct, and he sat on the other side of the stall with the particular helpless solidarity of someone who has no practical skill to offer but refuses to leave. At 6:15 in the morning, Flint passed the impaction. Wren monitored him for another hour, listened to gut sounds that were slowly, reluctantly returning, checked his vitals with the careful attention of someone who knows they are still not safe, but is becoming cautiously hopeful. "He's going to be okay," she said finally, at 7:40. Cesaly pressed her forehead to Flint's neck and closed her eyes. She didn't cry until she was outside, standing in the cold blue light of the Montana morning, her breath misting, the mountains turning pink at their edges. Then she stood in the yard and cried for a long time, for Flint partly, but also for Garrett, always for Garrett, and for the year she'd been living through, and for the hard, plain fact that love of any kind costs you something, that you pay for it in fear, that the capacity to be afraid of losing something is the same capacity that makes the having of it worth anything at all. Sully walked past her on his way to the water trough. He didn't stop, didn't look directly at her. But as he passed, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, one firm, brief press, and then kept walking. She understood perfectly. April in Montana comes in arguments with winter. It arrives and retreats and arrives again. Days of genuine warmth followed by hard frosts that kill anything that believed too early. But by mid-April, the balance tips and the land begins, grudgingly, to relent. Cesaly had been working Flint consistently since January, and what was emerging was something she hadn't expected when she started. Not a broke horse in the conventional sense, but a horse that had chosen to cooperate. The distinction mattered to her. She couldn't fully explain why, except that it had something to do with integrity, hers and his both. He took a saddle in late February, not without reservation. The first day with the blanket, he'd been still, watchful, but not afraid. The second day with the saddle, she'd felt the tension in him when the girth was first tightened, and she'd stood with him for 20 minutes. Just standing, until the tension released. The third day, she'd weighted the stirrups and let him move around the corral with the saddle empty. The fourth day, she'd put a foot in the stirrup, and then she'd waited another week before she got on. When she finally swung up into the saddle, Flint stood still for a long moment, his ears tracking back toward her, listening, assessing, and then he exhaled that long, low breath and took a step forward. And that was that. She wept a little in the saddle, which she suspected was going to be a theme of this year. By April, they were riding out onto the ranch together, crossing the pastures, checking fence lines, moving through the daily work of the double crook. Not as a spectacle, not as an achievement to be displayed, but as a practical partnership, which was, she'd come to understand, what Garrett had always intended. Not a show horse, not a trophy. A horse you could trust with the land. It was a Thursday in the third week of April when Crockett came back. She saw his truck from across the pasture while she was riding the north fence line with Flint. He was parked outside the main gate, engine running, which meant he'd been there a while, waiting for her to come in. She rode Flint back at a walk, taking her time, And when she got to the gate and dismounted and tied Flint to the post, she turned to face Crockett with the same patience she'd learned from the horse. The particular patience of someone who has stopped needing a situation to resolve in any particular way. He had a different document this time. Higher number. He set it on the hood of his truck without handing it to her. "I heard what happened with the colic," he said. "That's a lot of money to have walking around on 4 legs, Cesaly. You almost lost him." "Yes," she said, "and when calving comes, and it's coming, you've got a hard month ahead of you. You're going to be stretched." "Crockett," he stopped. "I know you think you're helping," she said. "I know that's probably even true, a little, but I need you to hear something." He waited. "This ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not after a hard calving, not after a bad year. Not ever, probably. I'm going to run this place until I can't, and then I'll figure out what comes next. What I'm not going to do is sell it, because you're more comfortable with the idea of a man running it." Something flickered across his face. She'd gotten close to something true, and they both knew it. "That's not," he started. "I know you don't think that's what it is," she said, not unkindly. "But I need you to sit with it anyway." He picked up the document from the hood of his truck. He folded it. He stood there for a moment looking at the ranch, at the pastures, at the barn, at Flint tied to the fence post, watching them both with intelligent dark eyes. "He's something," Crockett said, nodding toward Flint. Almost against his will, it seemed. "Yes," she said, "he is." Crockett got back in his truck. He drove away. And something about the way he drove, without pausing at the end of the driveway, the way he usually did, without the particular lingering quality she'd come to associate with a man keeping his options open, told her that this time it was different, that it was in some meaningful way done. She untied Flint from the post and stood with him for a while in the long afternoon light. She scratched his neck where she'd learned he liked it, in the hollow behind his ear, and he leaned into her hand the way he always did now. "You and me," she thought. "We figured it out." The calving came as predicted hard. 3 weeks of brutal early mornings and late nights, of interventions and losses. She lost 2 calves, which gutted her, and brought 17 safely into the world, which sustained her. Sully was steady through all of it. The reserve between them having been replaced by something more workmanlike and comfortable, a mutual respect that didn't need to announce itself. Odie discovered, somewhere in that stretch of exhausting weeks, that he had a natural instinct for the work that surprised them both, and Cesaly found herself trusting him with more and more, watching him grow into the job the way young people do when you simply stop doubting them and let them. On the last day of calving, when the final calf came safely and Cesaly was sitting in the barn with her back against a stall door and her boots caked with mud and her body emptied of everything it had, Sully sat down beside her and handed her a thermos cap full of whiskey. "Garrett would be proud," he said. She couldn't speak for a moment. "Yeah," she managed. "No, I mean it. Not would have been proud in a past tense way. Would be present tense." She looked at him. "The way you've run this place," he said. "The way you worked with that horse, the way you handled Crockett, all of it. He would be real proud." She cried. He didn't leave. He sat there and let her, which was the right thing to do. Outside, in the pasture, Flint was moving through the late spring grass, his dark coat catching the last of the light, his white-streaked forelock lifting in the breeze. He was not the most tractable horse she'd ever encountered. He would probably never be the easiest horse to work with. He had opinions, strong ones, and he expressed them in ways that required you to be paying attention. But he was hers, and she was his, and the double crook was still standing, still solvent, still hers, built on her grandfather-in-law's dream, and her husband's love, and her own refusal to accept the conclusion that everyone else had already written for her. June came soft and green, the way Montana summers do when they choose to be generous. The double crook had made it through its first full year without Garrett. Not easily, not without cost. She'd taken on a small bank loan in February to cover equipment repair and had paid it down ahead of schedule by May. She'd lost that first week of sleep every month until she stopped losing it. She'd eaten more frozen meals than she cared to admit, and had at some point in February simply stopped apologizing to herself for any of it. She'd made it. The ranch was not merely surviving. Under the surface, in the books, in the herd health and the maintenance records and the relationship she'd built with the feed supplier and the vet and the neighbors who mattered, it was more than surviving. It was functioning. It was, she allowed herself to think, even thriving in the quiet, incremental way that land-based things thrive. Not by dramatic declaration, but by the steady accumulation of right decisions over time. Thora Beckett came back in June and spent 3 days at the Double Crook. They worked with Flint together, and Thora asked, on the second day, whether Cesaly had ever thought about doing this professionally, about working with difficult horses the way she'd worked with him. Cesaly hadn't, until that moment. "I wouldn't know where to start," she said. "You start with one horse," Thora said. "You already did." She let that settle for a few days without answering. By the end of the week, she'd agreed to take on a second horse, a mare with trust issues that a family outside Harland Falls had given up on. Thora would provide guidance remotely, at least at first. It was a beginning of something, though she couldn't have told you what yet. Odie celebrated his 20th birthday in June, and they had a small party in the yard. Cesaly and Sully and Odie and Wren Calloway and a handful of neighbors. And at some point in the evening, Odie made a small speech about how he'd intended to only stay at the Double Crook for a season and had somehow failed to leave, and everyone laughed, and it was the first time in a long time that Cesaly had laughed with her whole body. She had a conversation that month with her mother, Nadine, who had been quietly worried about her daughter for a year and hadn't wanted to add to her burden by saying so. Nadine came for a weekend, and on the second evening, sitting on the porch with Flint visible in the pasture, Nadine said, "I was scared for you." "I know," Cesaly said. "Not scared that you'd fail, just scared for what you were carrying." "I know, Mom." "Are you okay? Really?" Cesaly thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. She thought about the grief that still lived in her, not crushing, not constant, but there, present as the mountains, a feature of the landscape of herself that she didn't expect to disappear and had stopped wanting to. "I'm not all the way okay," she said, "but I'm okay enough, and every month I'm a little closer." Nadine put her hand over hers. They sat there on the porch in the summer evening and watched Flint move through the long grass, and it was quiet, and it was enough. In August, Cesaly rode Flint to the top of the ridge that bordered the north end of the Double Crook, a place Garrett had loved and that she'd always gone to on foot, never on horseback, because the trail was narrow and the ascent steep, and the whole thing seemed like more drama than she needed from a horse. She went up with Flint, and it was nothing. He picked his way up the trail the way he did everything, with deliberate intelligence, with the quiet confidence of a horse who has decided you're worth trusting and has therefore committed to it entirely. From the top of the ridge, you could see the whole valley. The Double Crook spread out below her, the pastures and the barn and the bunkhouse and the corral where everything had begun, and beyond it the river and the town and the long grey highway that led eventually to everywhere else. The mountains rose in every direction, snow-capped still at their highest points even in August, permanent and enormous. She sat up there for a long time. She talked to Garrett, the way she did sometimes, not out loud, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who saw her, just in the interior way that you talk to people you loved who are no longer answerable. She told him about the year. She told him about Flint, which he already knew somehow, from wherever he was. She told him she was angry still sometimes, that he'd left her with all of this without warning, that she thought about that sometimes, the absence of warning, the way a single Tuesday afternoon had rearranged the entire architecture of her life. But she also told him what he'd given her, not just the ranch, she knew that, not just the years together, she knew that too. But this other thing, the thing she hadn't expected, the proof that she was capable of something hard. She hadn't known that about herself before the year Garrett died. She'd known she was capable of love and work and loyalty and patience. But she hadn't known about this, the specific strength that only difficulty can reveal, the person you turn out to be when you have no choice but to be someone. She knew now. Flint moved beneath her, weight shifting, and she brought her attention back to him, back to the ridge, back to the physical world of wind and grass and mountain. She scratched his neck. The magazine story had brought her unexpected things. A small but steady correspondence with women she'd never met, an invitation to speak at an agricultural conference in Missoula, which she'd accepted with enormous nerves and survived without embarrassing herself, a friendship with Reva, the journalist, who had turned out to be a genuine human being rather than someone mining her life for content, and Thora's question, which was still working in her, still opening something. She wasn't sure yet what the double crook would become, beyond what it had always been. Maybe nothing different, maybe the same ranch, run better year by year until she handed it to someone who would love it the way she and Garrett had. Maybe something more than that, some version of this work with horses, with difficult horses, with the kind of animals that the world had decided were beyond reach. She thought of all the things that had been decided in advance, about Flint, and about herself. She thought of the laughter from the fence line. She thought of the word crazy and what it means in a world that has decided in advance what you are. A word that gets applied to anyone who attempts something the audience has already finished. She was still here. The horse had his nose in her hand. Below her, the double crook glittered in the August heat. Hers, genuinely hers, hard-won and continuous. And that's the story of Cesaly Voss and Flint, a woman who walked into a corral that the whole county thought would undo her, and came out the other side of a year with something nobody had bet on. Not just the horse, not just the ranch, but herself. A version of herself that only the hardest year of her life could have made. I think what moves me about this story, and what I hope moved you, is that it isn't really about any special gift. It isn't about a magical connection or an innate talent that set Cesaly apart. It's about a woman who learned, in grief, how to be present without needing something back, and then discovered that this was, of all things, exactly what a broken horse needed too. The things that break us, the things they teach us, the way those two things are sometimes unexpectedly the same. If this story landed with you, if it gave you something to think about or reminded you of something you're carrying, I'd love to know. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what the story brought up for you. Hit that like button if this was worth your hour. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, stories about real people, about the quiet, difficult, beautiful work of refusing to give up. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there.